Hello students, in our last session I had started with the book Footprints Without Feet and I started with lesson 1. So today I am going to continue further and we will finish off with this chapter today. So I request all of you to do a good thorough reading of the chapter once it is finished. Mark out the difficult words in your books so that when you are doing. So students, I hope you have given a reading to your previous portions and you have understood the story at least till the point we have done. So now we are going to start from here at the surgery. Now surgery over here means Mr. Heriot is meaning as a hospital. Normally surgery is an operation, but here Mr. Heriot is considering surgery as a hospital and probably that the operation is a way of treatment. In the same way, Mr. Heriot is considering the hospital as a way of treatment. So there we can resemble the two things. So at the end of surgery, the household dog searched round me, Tricky, down on the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down. Look, so here, as soon as Mr. Heriot enters the surgery, the dogs searched round me. Searched means to come in a forceful way. So they all came in a forceful way towards Mr. Heriot. And Tricky, who was along with Mr. Heriot, he looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. So we see that Tricky is having no energy. And he lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So very soon the other dogs, they just smelled Tricky all around him, and then they found out that since Tricky is not responding to their actions, so they found him uninteresting and they just ignored him and went away from that place. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So we have seen that Mrs. Pumphrey has been giving a very special treatment. She treats Tricky as her own son, and he has lived in a very lavish way in her house. But then at Mr. Heriot's hospital, we find that he is getting the same treatment as the other dogs get. So his bed has been made next to the other dogs. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So here we find that for 2 days Mr. Heriot has fed him with nothing except water. Now this action is just opposite to what Mrs. Pumphrey was doing. Mrs. Pumphrey was giving extra meals. So here he has not been fed also for 2 days. Only water was given. And at the end of the second day, he just showed a little bit of interest in his surrounding. And it was only on the third day that he began to whimper. Now what is whimper? It's a very low sound that is made out of pain. So at least Tricky is now able to respond. Now he is whimpering to what? He is whimpering to the other dogs who were in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. So Tricky is engulfed. Now we'll see what is trotted. Trotted means taking very short steps and running. So when the door was opened, Tricky took very small steps and he went out immediately, and soon he was surrounded. Engulfed means surrounded. So he was surrounded by the greyhound whose name was Joe, and along with Joe, we have Joe's friends also surrounding Tricky. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. So here we see that this is a way the dogs are trying to become friends with each other. So first they rolled around Tricky, and then Tricky slowly started following the dogs. Later that day, I was present at the feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sound of high-speed eating. Now see, as soon as the food was served to the dogs, who served the food? Tristan. Tristan served the food. So as soon as the food was served to the dogs, they would just give a headlong rush. Headlong rush means with a very initial speed they would run and go and have the food. Now why did they go and have the food in speed? So we'll just find out. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Now this is because in case some food was left in any dog's bowl, then that food will be shared by the other dogs also. So he will not have that food alone. He or she, that dog, will not be able to have that food alone. So if you don't want to share the food, you have to eat the food fast. So that is the reason as soon as the food was served, everyone would rush to finish off the food so that they don't need to share it with others. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day an extra bowl was put for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So next day when the food was given, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls, and then he started licking it casually, inside and outside. After finishing, he started licking it. That means he is still hungry. So the next day, when the bowl of food was given, he was given an extra bowl because Mr. Hiriot could analyze it that he was not satisfied with the food that was being given, so he needed some extra food, so he was given the extra bowl. And as soon as Tricky had it, Tricky just pushed. Jostling means to push. So he just pushed himself to find the place for himself and have the food. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all the day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. So this is the medical treatment that Mr. Hiriot is giving. We talked about the surgery. Now this is the surgery that is being given. That he is not given any medicine as such, but then he is given very limited amount of food, and he is made to do a lot of physical activities. He runs around with his friends, with the other dogs, and scrimmages. What does here the word scrimmages means? Scrimmages means rough, confused struggle. So he is joining in the running with the other dogs, joining with the friends, and they just push each other, they enjoy themselves, play with each other, and they enjoy themselves. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed every minute. So bowled over means you just push each other, dhakka-mukki, a sort of dhakka-mukki. Tramped also is to stand on each other's foot, and scrimmages is against and squash is again the hard pushes to each other. So it's just a friendly approach to each other. He became an accepted member of the gang, and unlikely silky little objects among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at the meal times, and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. So he was now an accepted member in the gang. So gang of Joe and the other friends. So he was an accepted member, and just like the other dogs, he was a little different. Why? Because the other dogs were quite shaggy. They were shaggy means untidy. So, but Tricky had a silky Tricky was like a silky little object. So Tricky's hair was quite silky, because we know that Mrs. Pumphrey used to take a good care of Tricky. and they would share they would fight like the tigers, share their meals, and they would even go for hunting of rats in the old hen house at night. So these are the activities that Tricky was doing. He had never had such a time in his life. Obviously, when you are living in a very posh environment, you are missing out some part of your life, some activities. So now that poshness is not there, that luxury is not there in Tricky's life, and Tricky is living a normal life just like the other dogs live. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen of times a day for the latest bulletins. And meanwhile, Mrs. Pumphrey was every day giving a call, a dozen of calls. That means almost 12 times she would give a call in a day to find out the latest bulletins. Bulletin over means news, and hovered here means to move around. So Mrs. Pumphrey was very worried, and she would move here and there anxiously just to get some news of Tricky. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. Now Mr. Heriot, dodged means avoided. So Mr. Heriot avoided the questions of whether his cushions, whether Tricky's cushions were being turned regularly, and whether he was given the correct coat to wear. We have earlier studied that Tricky has a number of coats: winter coat, rain coat, summer coat. So she would ask, Mrs. Pumphrey would ask whether Tricky is being given the correct coat to wear, whether you are changing the positions of the cushions. So Mr. Heriot would just avoid such questions. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. So Mr. Heriot would just tell Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky is doing fine, he is out of danger, and convulsing is recovering, and he is rapidly recovering from illness.